This video is sponsored by Only Crits. A few months ago, and sorry it's taken me so long to get to it, it's been a wild few months, but the folks at Kobold Press sent me a review copy of their book, Campaign Builder, Cities and Towns. They didn't give me any money to review it, they didn't ask me to say anything in particular or to focus on anything specific in the book, they just wanted me to take a look, and if I thought I had something to say, then I could share those thoughts with my audience. Now, there are a few reasons I'm talking about this now. One is that over the next few months, I am planning to talk about a lot of 5e products from publishers other than Wizards of the Coast. I've got a bunch of them, and I want to finally dig into some of them and give you my thoughts. But also in my Critical Role Demystified series, we've reached the point where the city of Amman just experienced a pretty seismic change, and the party is about to go and deal with the city's underground. Additionally, in future episodes, they're going to start journeying all over the world and visiting other cities, and Matt Mercer needs to make those cities feel real. So in light of all the effort he put into Amman finally paying off in the Chroma Conclave arc, and before we talk about some of the episodes that take place in other cities, I wanted to talk about this book, Campaign Builder, Cities and Towns. What can this book teach us about creating our own complex, realistic, vibrant population centers? Now, I'm going to run through some of the content of this book in broad detail, but I'm also going to use it as the foundation for an upcoming Patreon-exclusive live stream. On October 22nd at 3 p.m. Pacific, I'm going to go live and work on a city set in the campaign setting we created in some earlier live streams. And we'll be using this book as the step-by-step guide to create a settlement. You'll get to see my process and the book's process hopefully come together in a cool way. And I'll take questions from the audience. We'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. The live streams are a thank you to my Patreon supporters for everything they do for me. So if you want to be a part of that live stream, join my Patreon at $3 a month or more before October 22nd. Also, before we get into this book, just as an aside, I know the Dungeon Master has a whole section about creating settlements, and I'm not going to sit here and compare them, but I'll just say this book exists in response to the information, or arguably the lack of information, in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Like, that section in that book was maybe 5 or 10 pages, and this book is more than 250 pages, so, it's not really worth comparing them. They're not the same. But you should compare dice. Okay, not my finest segue ever. This video is sponsored by Only Crits. Only Crits is a fantastic dice company that makes gorgeous dice. And when I roll with them, I only ever roll crits. What? We're not allowed to say that? But they're called Only Crits. I can't imply that I only roll crits when I roll the dice from Only... I guess I can't. Okay. Well, you know what I'll do? I'll just not say that. And the audience will know what I'm thinking. I can't do that either. Can't do that either. Okay. Well, they sell dice. And that's cool. Visit onlycrits.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code supergeek at checkout to save 12% off your order. Once again, that's onlycrits.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code supergeek. Thank you so much to Only Crits for sponsoring this video. Also, I was just doing a bit. There's actually no rules about what I can and can't say in any ads. It's just a joke. We have fun. The book opens with a section about defining the purpose of a city. Now, this is less about figuring out the role the city will play in your campaign, although that is important. It's something you should consider. But instead, this offers some really useful advice for figuring out how this settlement came to be and what purpose it serves in the world. And it does so with one of my favorite tools as a game master, and especially as a world builder, charts! I love random charts when I'm world building because otherwise, I get really bad analysis paralysis. I'll often run down every possible version of a new location, or a plot point, or a major event, or whatever. And so sometimes using a random chart helps me a lot. It helps me figure out when to draw the line and say, okay, this is just what the city is like now, let's just work off of that, rather than spending the next 2 days making a pro-con list about how old the city should be. By the way, I'm going to use city as a shorthand throughout this video, but you can probably guess from the use of the word town in the title of the book that you could use this resource to create settlements of any age and any type. These tools are very flexible. I also really like the section about the different community ages. They're really useful for getting a sense of how to make a new community feel distinct from a young community, or a mature community, or an ancient community. They also have charts to determine the primary function behind why the city came to be. Now, this doesn't mean that it's the only thing that the city does now, it's just the reason the city came into being. Now, I could argue that the items on this list are a bit too specific. Like, the first result is creation. The honey from this region is exquisite and makes wonderful candies from crystallized honey. That's really specific and very different from the open-endedness of some of my other favorite charts in other D&D books. But also, as a counterpoint, how many cities are you likely to have in your campaign? How many options do you really need? If you get the same result for your next city, just re-roll it. Or don't. I mean, maybe two cities were founded by the same honeymaker or rival honeymakers. That doesn't mean that both cities are still devoted to honey. Or maybe they are, and you've got a long-standing rivalry between the two cities. That could actually work really well. This book also reminds me that cities need to have trade goods. That's something I'm personally terrible at establishing in my world. Then there's a really great section about laying out the different definitions, implications, and potential of the different size settlements. For example, each one includes a different description of the type of population density you might expect to find in, for example, a town versus a village versus a city. And those sorts of details really help you enhance your descriptions in your own games. Then there's some info about the different types of governmental structures. And while I think I've seen a chart like this in the Dungeon Master's Guide, there are other items on this one, like multiple different types of monarchy, depending on whether the ruler is a figurehead or not, or the corporatocracy, which is the world we live in here in America. Then we go on to discuss how much magic should be present in the city. And obviously there's no wrong answer here. I am on the record about how I feel about very high magic settings, but that does not mean that it's wrong for you or your game. And even in my game, I would make an exception when I thought that it served the story. But one of the reasons I so often dislike high magic settings is because a lot of the time, it feels like the consequences of having that kind of magic available to everyone was just not well thought through. But what this book does is it talks you through a lot of the potential consequences, positive and negative, of different levels of magic, and different kinds of the different levels of magic. For example, when discussing how a high magic city might handle construction, the book points out that a spellcaster could build a building by themselves with magic, or mundane construction workers could use illusions to establish what the building should look like and then use it as a guide as they work. Or golems could actually perform the manual labor while being commanded by mortals. They still don't tell you exactly what you should do as the world builder in question, although if you can't decide, there's always a chart you can roll on. But each section does give you a lot of guidance on what sort of options are available to you, just enough to get your own mind spinning about the different possibilities. Then there's a really, really cool section about mapping your city, and it truly starts at the fundamentals, figuring out what the terrain looks like when the city begins. This is something that I'd imagine a lot of GMs struggle with, if you're anything like me anyway. I try to think about landmarks, but I really only worry about it too much if I have an idea for a cool way to integrate it into the structure of the city, or if it's important to the story. But this book really encourages you to think about city design the way people actually do in the real world, by starting with a stretch of land and asking, hey, why are you building a city here? There's info here about how the different types of climates can affect the founding and development of civilizations, and even the architecture of individual buildings. And then it's time to talk about the different districts of your city. This book gives you recommendations and insights for lots of potential types of city districts, and it gets extremely thorough. For example, the section about the docks district of your city includes examples of the sort of features docks tend to have, like a place for fishers, a port, a naval base, and a waterfront for luxury purposes. It's got examples of the kind of businesses you might find at the dock, like entertainers, fishmongers, couriers, captains chartering ships, recruiters, shops and stalls, gambling, and a trading company. It's got advice on chartering vessels, suggestions about criminal elements, and dock-specific adventure hooks. And that was all just one district. They've got 7. The Docks District, Government District, Guard District, Market District, Religious District, Residential District, and Sewer/Underbelly District. And they each have so much attention to detail. The Market District has sample shops, so you don't necessarily have to make a whole bunch of vendors, which is personally one of my least favorite parts of building a city or town. The Residential District offers descriptions of a bunch of different types of communities, which is very helpful. And the Government District section has this illustration of a kobold wearing judge's robes and a powdered wig, so honestly, no notes. Anyway, I super duper do not have time to get into everything this section has to offer, but even if you have nothing else that you could use this book for, this section alone makes this book extremely valuable when building a city. But a city is nothing without the people who live in it, so the book gives us a ton of advice on populating your community. There's suggestions of different types of rulers and city officials, and then there's a section on noble families, and we get maybe my favorite part of this chapter, the chart of family secrets. For example, I rolled randomly on this chart, and I got a 19. The family owes a small fortune to the Wave Rider Trading Consortium with no current means to pay it back. Extremely minor succession spoilers here, but that's literally what happens in the second episode of the first season. So trust me, you can mine years of drama out of a noble family's increasingly harebrained schemes as they attempt to claw their way out of debilitating debt. The noble family section is also the first part of this chapter to include sample adventures if you have a player character who is a member of a noble family, which is a really nice addition. Then we get a bunch of information about the guilds, and I've never really been a big guild guy as a player. Having a character who has the guild member background has just never been an especially compelling idea to me. But when you're building a city, you really need guilds, so I know I'm going to lean on this section a lot when I create my next city. Especially the section about illicit guilds, which I especially like the section because it doesn't stick exclusively to the language that we've been using for almost 50 years, which is the Thieves Guild. Because that's not necessarily accurate. There are tons of examples of other types of illicit guilds here. Then we get other organizations like mercenary companies, city guards, cults, all the things you need to keep a D&D campaign moving. It's awesome. There's info on hirelings and henchmen with some fun charts for determining what skills the hirelings might have depending on their former profession, and some fun charts of mannerisms, and there's a section on monstrous citizens which has a lot of excellent material discussing how creatures with radically different body types and sizes that are unlike an ordinary humanoid might find it challenging to navigate in traditional cities. Then we get a really good broad selection of stat blocks for NPCs and new monsters you might find in a city or town. My favorite new monster is the Bookworm, because of course it is, you knew it was gonna be. Its name is a pun, it lives in bookshelves, it basically has the same origin as the Vashta Nerada from Doctor Who, and it has a paper-cut themed breath weapon. But I also really like the Lock Mimic and the Pet Mimic, those are both great as well. And then we get to Chapter 4, and the book starts talking about how you can use your city in your game. It starts with information about introducing your party to the city, and some advice for if you want to make the city a quest hub, which is someplace that the party returns to between adventures, like they used to do in old school games. There's a great sidebar about how you can immerse your players in the idea of a quest hub through miniatures and terrain, or a slide/page on a VTT, because that sense of familiarity is really valuable. That being said, speaking personally, some of this information would have been really useful earlier in the book. I think it might be a little weird to get to this point in the city creation process and realize that, yeah, actually you would like this to be a quest hub, and then maybe you realize that the city you've built so far doesn't fit that vibe because you didn't know about the quest hub idea. You were just starting with the idea of a city-based adventure, and now you might have to completely reorient your approach to your city. But anyway, then we get some great sections about local laws, crime and punishment, taxes. There's some really good advice for using status as a reward instead of just rewarding parties with gold all the time, which is a really smart idea for an urban campaign or a campaign where the party uses a city as a quest hub, especially in something like a West Marches game where stories swapped by player characters are really important. We've got a section on urban encounters, and I especially like that it recommends that you should adjust the danger of physical attacks in cities if your game overall has more gritty or violent encounters. And it gives you several in-world justifications on how to do that. For example, maybe dueling is legal, so nobody really cares if your party throws down in the middle of town. That's my favorite example, but they're all good. There's also a section about obstacles in the street during an urban encounter, which is great whether you're running a fight or a chase, and a section about the role of citizens during an urban encounter, which is also great. But right between these, we get kind of a weird inclusion. To randomly determine the setup for an urban encounter, roll a d20 twice, and consult the staging idea generator table, applying the objective to either the characters or the antagonists, or choose an appropriate event and objective. And this is a great chart. You've got events like baptisms, festivals, funerals, a knighting, a play, a witch burning, and you've got objectives like acquire covert information, break up a relationship, collect a debt, grandstand or heckle, prevent a marriage. It's a great chart. I'm definitely going to use it in a campaign the next time I have to generate a plot idea for an urban setting. But why is it here, between two different features about how the people in your city might react to your encounter or your chase? Why isn't it a few pages earlier, right at the top of the section about urban encounters? Or even just a page later than it is when we move on to discussing urban adventures? Why is it here breaking up the flow of this great section? Why are chase rules in D&D always so weird and rough? Anyway, there's a great chart right after this about how witnesses might react, and another to determine how they interpreted what they saw, and those are so much more relevant to the topic we were just talking about. Just weird that that one chart was in there, but it's fine. Then we get the section about urban adventures, including how to structure an urban campaign. I like how it breaks down what you need. Short-term goals, long-term goals, a dilemma, major events, and the endgame. These elements would be extremely useful for any long-running campaign you're running, but I'd imagine they're even more important to get right when the campaign is basically set in or revolves around one single location. There's also a terrific paragraph on realism versus fantasy, which we're going to do a whole other video about some other day, but honestly, if you want to know what I'm going to say in that video, read this one paragraph on page 165 of this book. They pretty much nail it. Then there's some great advice for sandbox adventures, which actually expands the sandbox metaphor to give relevant advice, using terms like clean sand or toys to discuss aspects of campaign design. It's actually really well done. I might make a future video about these terms because they're super useful. Then there's a bunch of adventure seeds and campaign seeds, which are the kinds of suggestions that I always find enormously helpful when I'm preparing for my games. And then, and this is vital, We get some honest-to-God advice on how to run a city. Like, how do you handle all the NPCs and locations? How do you keep from getting overwhelmed or from overwhelming your players? How do you even do this? And I'm not going to get into all that advice, but right away, the book flat out says that you need to change your style. If you try to run a game the same way you'd run a dungeon, you'll overwhelm your players with details, and that kind of game also takes way too long to prepare. You need to handle the city more abstractly, which I absolutely agree with. There's advice on keeping the focus and having contingency plans and how the themes of your campaign can dictate the type of city you make and the role it serves. It's a great piece of advice, really, but you know what I'm going to say, right? How this section on themes on page 177 is about 170 pages too deep into the book? If you're going to start with how to build up the city, put advice like this up front as well. If you read this book, I might actually recommend you start with chapters 4 and 5, which we'll discuss chapter 5 in a minute, and then go back to the early chapters to actually build your city. And then maybe go through chapter 4 and 5 again after that, because approaching a lot of this material once you've already had your idea for the city, once you know what it looks like, that would be really valuable. Some of this is really mostly helpful if you've already made the city. But some you should probably start to think about before you make the city. That's just my point. Anyway, chapter 5 is about the role the player characters play in your city. There's info about owning property, titles and privileges, and relationships and favors. And then we get some new backgrounds to help make the character feel like someone who is at home in a city. This is something that I've struggled with in the past. Outside of the guild artisan and the urchin, the player's handbook doesn't really have a ton of backgrounds that make you feel like just some dude living in the city. But this book has backgrounds like appraiser, midwife, public servant, and vigilante. Yes, you heard me right. When you're making characters for a city-based campaign, one of those characters could just be Batman. But honestly, is it strange that I'm more excited to play a midwife who finds themselves thrust into a fantasy adventure? There's something really beautiful about including a background like that in a D&D book, and I think playing that character would be really lovely. And as we've learned from Katara in Avatar: The Last Airbender, people who know how to deliver babies can still absolutely be badass adventurers. We also get some subclasses. Now, as I've said in other videos, I'm not looking at these with an eye for balance. That's not really my area of expertise, and I also think worrying about balance is overrated, so I'm going to talk more about the vibes of these subclasses. There's the Bard subclass, the College of Chicanery, which really leans into the con man, artful dodger style character, and is absolutely my kind of trash. I love it so much, though probably not for the midwife character. We get the Community Domain Cleric, which is basically someone who just cares a lot about their community and civilization. It's kind of like Kingston Brown from The Unsleeping City, at least based on what I've had a chance to see from that campaign. We get the Circle of the Sewer Druid, where one of your powers is that you literally make yourself gross and sticky, and another power is that you can taste street water to see what happened recently. It's so gross, but it's so specific that I kind of love it. There's the fighter archetype, the Rake, which is not like the gardening tool. It's basically the over-talented, immature, rich asshole subclass. And it's more of a charisma-based fighter, like the fighter version of the Swashbuckler. The Monk gets the Way of Leaps and Bounds, which is literally just a parkour subclass. One of the features is just straight up called free running. Although my favorite feature is Bounding Knee, which lets you spend a key point to add damage when you charge an enemy. Because the name reminds me of this awesome moment from the best fight in Captain America: The Winter Soldier. And then we get an absolutely fascinating subclass to include, the Paladin Oath of Revolution, which is about working to protect people from injustice, even if it means working against the establishment. It's a great way to encourage players to consider paladins as something other than agents of the status quo. It almost implicitly encourages you to rethink what your alignment might mean, since I look at this and go, yeah, that is also a totally valid approach to a lawful good character. And it's a reflection of the fact that, as we saw through the Summer of Strikes, the machines of civilization will chew up its citizens unless people stand up against it. We get an Urban Ranger, which is not a subclass. It's just a replacement class features for the core Ranger. So you can still play any kind of Ranger, but the bones of the character class would be better tuned to an urban campaign, and I think that is a really smart decision. The Rogue subclass we get is the Skirmish Surgeon, which is kind of like a battlefield medic mixed with Riddick. It's very interesting. And the Wizard subclass, well, what else could it be? It's a street magic subclass. My favorite feature is the Magic Hat. It's a 10th level ability, which I wish could come earlier, but I acknowledge that probably for game balance reasons that would be a horrible idea, because it's kind of like a tiny bag of holding that you keep in your hat. Then we get a couple of city-themed magic items and spells. There are not a ton, because a lot of magic already works perfectly well in a city already, but there are a few that are meant to draw on specific elements of life in a city, like Voice of the Masses, which overwhelms a target with the noise of the thoughts of everybody nearby, or Cobblestone Quake, which does exactly what it sounds like it does. And that's it. that's the book. As you can probably tell, I am really excited about it, and I think it's absolutely worth picking up. Again, I don't get a cut of that or anything like that, I'm just a fan. And also, again, if you want to see it in action, then I would love for you to come and join my Patreon. Like I said, we're going to do a live stream on the 22nd to use this book to build a city for my next campaign setting. It might actually be the home base for a theoretical West Marches game that I would love to run someday. So hopefully we'll learn a lot about building a quest hub. It's going to be fun. In the meantime, if you like this video, you know what to do. Like, comment, subscribe, ring bell, join Patreon, get rewards, join Discord, talk to cool people, join Twitch, watch me play videos and make games. Nope, other way around. Click here, watch a video about when Vox Machina went back to their ruined home base city. It's a good video. Until next time, play fair and have fun.